In this video, I want to briefly review some options for formative assessment. But first, let's be clear about our terminology. One way to think about the difference between formative and summative assessment is to think of formative assessment as assessment for learning and summative assessment as assessment of learning. That is, the main purpose of formative assessment is to find out where students are so that adjustments can be made if needed. And the main purpose of summative assessment is more to find out whether students have learned. And usually it's to then assign them a grade based on their performance on that assessment. So this is connected to the other big difference between formative and summative assessments. And that is that formative assessments are typically much lower stakes in the sense of not having a huge impact on students' grades, at least each individual assessment. Whereas summative assessments typically are much higher stakes and have a bigger impact on the student grade. Of course, it isn't always quite as clear-cut as that, but that usually works as a general approximation. There's a lot of research on how and why formative assessments are important for student learning, but in this video, I'm going to just focus on what types of formative assessments you might consider using. So the first type is daily, or at least frequent and regular, quizzes. And by quiz, I'm referring to any time that you ask students questions about course materials. Generally, these are in multiple choice or short answer format. And you are actually looking for specifically right or wrong answers. In a synchronous class, this might be done by using clickers in a face-to-face class. If you're doing a synchronous online course via Zoom, you could use the polling feature in Zoom, or you could use other kinds of polling capabilities, such as an online form or something like that. There's a note here about this being best with peer instruction. Peer instruction refers to asking students a question, asking them to register their response individually, but then giving them time to discuss their responses with someone else, with another student sitting next to them or in small groups, and then re-asking the question. This is a method that's been pioneered by Eric Mazur in physics at Harvard and has shown a lot of impact on the sort of getting students to recognize the common issues or common pitfalls with certain kinds of concepts that they better understand when a peer explains it to them rather than the instructor. In an asynchronous course, or if you want to give a quiz asynchronously, like before class or while they're watching an online video, you could use the quizzing tools in the learning management system, either Blackboard or Canvas. There's also a tool called Play Pause It, which allows you to have students watch a video, like a recorded lecture, and stop periodically to ask clicker type questions. So it's a way to replicate using clickers in a face-to-face or synchronous session, but in an asynchronous way. The second type of formative assessment that I want to talk about is known as a minute paper. Now, this term is used for a wide range of specific prompts that I'll give you some examples in a second. But what they have in common is that these are less about questions that have right or wrong answers and really more about prompting reflection. For implementation, you could use the same questions every class, or you could tailor the questions to the specific material that's being covered at the time, and I'll show you some examples of that as well. For a synchronous session, if you're face-to-face, good old paper and index cards works just fine. If you want to use an online form, Google Forms or the learning management system works well for that. If you're doing a synchronous class session in Zoom, then you can use simply the chat box in Zoom for that. Again, asynchronously, there's lots of tools to collect these responses, discussion boards in the learning management system or Google Forms. I said that minute papers cover sort of a range of different kinds of reflective prompts. One really popular way to use minute papers is to encourage review and connection between what you're doing now and what has been covered in the past. So asking students what they think is the most important thing they've learned this week or this in this day, this one class, and also to get them to think about questions, to give you their questions, what questions they might still have. Similarly, encouraging feedback through asking a question like, what's one thing that's not clear at this point in time? You can also use minute papers to get students to reflect in ways that further their learning by making connections, right? So maybe at the beginning of a topic, you can ask them to brainstorm or do a little brain dump of everything they already know. This helps you as you prepare your lecture or your material to understand where you still need to either review or where you can make connections. Asking students to connect what you're doing today to things you've done in the past, or to provide an example of concepts. This is one of my favorites, simply because as I get older, I have a harder time coming up with examples that are relevant to students. So I ask them to give me those examples and to make those connections. Minute papers are also really useful for prompting metacognition. That is, getting students to think about their thinking, to think about their process of learning. So for example, a common question or minute paper is to do what's called an exam wrapper, where you ask students what they've done in order to learn or to prepare for a particular exam or assignment, and also to reflect on what they think might have been effective or not as effective, and to make a plan for how they might do things differently the next time. Another common type of minute paper is what's known as a reading reflection. This is something that you could do as a way to prompt reading before class. There's something that you want students to do, either a reading or if you're teaching an online course, maybe it is a video reflection because they've watched a pre-recorded video. But asking them something like, what's the most important thing that you got out of the reading or the video, or what's a question you still have? That's a way of both getting information about what they believe is important or what questions they have, but it also can serve as an incentive mechanism. That is, you ask them to complete or turn in these reading or video reflections before moving on to the next thing in the class.